Closed captioning of this program is made possible by the Fireman's Fund Foundation.
This week on our news panel, a giant step for national health care reform.
This wasn't an easy vote for a lot of people, but it was the right vote.
But the debate rages on in Congress and across the country. What's next for the bill and how will it affect California? Governor Schwarzenegger defies a judge's ruling to end furloughs for tens of thousands of state workers and says instead that he will appeal. And Google pulls out of mainland China because of its censorship policy. So what's ahead for the giant Silicon Valley company? Also, the battle of Salmon to survive against the odds.
If we didn't act when we did, not only would we have not had this program, I don't think there would have been any hope for the coho salmon in the Russian River watershed.
A conversation with John Boland, KQED's new president and CEO. An exhibit at the San Francisco Contemporary Jewish Museum breaks new ground on ancient tradition. And Bay Area cooks compete to find the best recipes on Food and Wine this week with Leslie Sabaco. Coming up next. Good evening, I'm Belva Davis, and welcome to This Week in Northern California. Joining me on our news panel, Eric Savage, West Coast editor of Barron's, on Google's move from mainland China. And Marisa Lagos, staff writer with San Francisco Chronicle, with an update on state workers' furloughs. And Sarah Varney, reporter with KQED Public Radio on healthcare reform and what it means for California. So, Sarah, we start with you. Much of this debate has been about what's in it for me. So what's in it for California?
Well, California has the largest number of uninsured in the country. We have about 8.2 million people. So the state certainly stands to benefit probably disproportionately than other states, for certainly at that level. We'll have about 5 to 6 million people who will gain insurance through this new healthcare law. They're wide estimates at this point, so because for a variety of reasons. But many of those people will gain coverage through a new Medicaid expansion. So Medicaid will be open to people who earn higher incomes than they do now. It'll be open. It'll also be open to people who are so-called childless adults, which is a really inartful term. But essentially, Medicaid has always been this program that's really been meant for mostly mothers and children and the disabled. And so I think there's a lot of misconception about Medicaid that somehow if you're poor, regardless of if you're poor, you get health insurance, which is not the case. So there'll be that change in the Medicaid program. There's also going to be very generous government subsidies for people to buy private insurance. It's going to go up to about 400% of the federal poverty level. So for a family of 4 that earns $88,000 a year, that's the top end at which you can qualify for some government subsidies. There's a lot in here for employers, particularly for small businesses. There's about $4 billion in new tax credits to help small businesses offer health insurance to their employees. And there's also a lot of these individual market reforms, which I'm sure a lot of us have heard about. There's going to be this ban on insurers not accepting you because you have a pre-existing condition. There's going to be a ban on insurers charging you more because you're sicker or because you're older, because you're a woman, which was always the case before. And then also for young adults, there's a lot in there. I mean, obviously we saw the unemployment numbers that came out this week. We're still at about 12.5%, I think, unemployment in California. A lot of that are these younger people who are graduating from colleges and not able to find work. So those people will be able to, who are uninsured, will be able to go back on their parents' insurance policy up until age 26.
Well, this was a bitter fight in the Congress. The Republicans had a forecast of disaster if this passed. That was the politic of it. Now that the word is out and people are beginning to hear at least some of these upside things, how is it faring in the public view?
I think people are going to find a lot in this to like. I think even in some of these more conservative districts where they had, Republican congressmen who voted against the bill, many of those districts have very high rates of uninsurance in California. Many of those districts have older people pre-Medicare age who are not able to get insurance. So they'll benefit from these new high-risk pools. That's actually one of the very first things that's going to go into effect within 90 days of when the bill was signed. So just in a couple months here, you will actually be able to apply for a high risk to the high risk pool. It's very unclear how it's going to work at this point, but essentially it'll be much more affordable coverage. There'll be no lifetime cap. There'll be no annual cap on your medical expenses, which is very different how the state high risk pool works now. So I think as people, as I was saying before we started the show, I've been getting calls and emails from listeners. Just, here's my personal situation. I'm 54 years old. I drive a cab. My son is 23. Everybody really wants to understand kind of what's in it for them.
But a lot of this really isn't spelled out yet, correct? I mean, there's a lot of things that need to happen before, for example, you could tell me exactly how it might affect me if I lose my job. Is that true? The legislation certainly establishes sort of the broad outlines of the program, and then you're absolutely right that now Secretary Sebelius' office is very busy trying to interpret what the Congress actually meant, and they will have to go through and now write tomes of regulations that will get then sent out to other people who will write additional tomes of regulations. So yeah, it's a process to certainly get this out into the public.
So what's the impact on the state budget? The governor's kind of come out and said he believes in healthcare reform, but at the same time, there's the real impact on the state budget, which is already, of course, in something of a difficult situation.
So there's sort of two issues here. One is, there was this so-called Cornhusker kickback or whatever that was, that there was somehow special treatment for certain states. That actually is now done away with in the reconciliation bill. So in the reconciliation bill, all states are treated the same, and they increase the subsidies to the states. So for the first about 6 years of this program, of this Medicaid expansion, of the high-risk pool, all these things are actually 100% federally paid for. It is, and also there is an increase in, a required increase in reimbursement rates to primary care physicians, which has been a big problem in California. We are 49th in terms of our reimbursement rates to physicians in our Medicaid program. So this will greatly increase the reimbursement rates. It is true that after 6 years or so, those subsidies, the state will have to take on more responsibility of those subsidies. It'll still be a federal-state split eventually. But you are correct in that the bill does say that the states have to have maintenance of effort in their public insurance program. So in our Medicaid program, for instance, the legislature couldn't reduce eligibility, for instance, to save money to close the budget deficit. They can't eliminate the Healthy Families Program, which is a program for the children of low-income, working poor families who earn just too much to qualify for Medicaid.
Which is what the governor wanted to do.
That will he had proposed eliminating that program. I'm not sure how serious he was about that. I think it was a bit more of a
But he can't do it. And then there was, on the add-ons, the odd bills that came after the major legislation, there was big news about Pell Grants and making it easier for students in California, particularly, go to college.
This is true, and I should say I'm the health reporter, so I tend to, the bill was big enough in terms of how it was going to affect the healthcare system. So I don't know.
I love the title, the healthcare bill, with the educational pluses.
Well, clearly that was something the Democrats, it was a priority for them, and they knew that this reconciliation vehicle was the way they were going to get it through the Congress, and so that's the way they did it.
So all the legislative things that have to be done have been done. Now it is
the president has to sign the reconciliation bill.
He has not done that.
He has not done that.
That doesn't seem like a problem.
No, I don't think that we're going to have a problem getting him to sign that.
Well, the governors, we talked about him going off and on. We're now going to move directly to where he is really the guy. So, Marisa, the governor not only halted the judge's order about really stopping furloughs for state workers, but he also vetoed some legislation that would have done this. So what ground is he standing on to do this?
Executive authority, essentially. This is, one of more than 24 lawsuits that have been filed over the past year over these employee furloughs. Originally furloughed about 238,000 state workers. The lawsuit this week dealt with about 65 to 75,000 of them. And what it really was aimed at is folks that work at places that don't get their money from the general fund, the DMV, Caltrans, the employment office. And what the judge said was that this is causing harm and that these employees should get back pay and that they should go back to work. Now, the governor has promised to appeal this decision on Monday. If he wins that appeal, which he is, of course, confident he will, these folks will have to stay home next Friday. If he loses, or if the appeals court says we need some time to really look at this, folks could be staying home. Now, you're right. The next day, he also decided to veto a piece of legislation by the Senate pro tem President Darrell Steinberg. That would have applied to mostly these same workers and about 15 or 20,000 more that work at places that actually collect money, like the Franchise Tax Board and those sorts of places. So we're really looking at a long battle that has kind of no end in sight other than the fact on the legal front. Now, the governor has said, proposed in his next year's budget, which begins July 1, he doesn't want these furloughs to continue. He'd like to see state workers' pay cut. So that'll be a whole nother fight. But right now we're really seeing all of this being adjudicated. And a lot of questions remain. What's going to happen if the employees continue to win, which they have, if the appeals court, if the Supreme Court agrees? Will the state owe more than $1 billion in back pay?
So does it go past the appeal decision? Does the governor now have grounds to just say, we'll wait till the Supreme Court gets around to it, or does the Supreme Court, do we even know if the Supreme Court will take this?
We don't know, and really we're talking about a number of different cases, so that's part of the reason it's so confusing. But in general, what has happened is that the judges have ruled in general in employees' favor, but then have stayed those orders pending appeal decisions. So in general, everyone's still at home, except for corrections workers, of course, who have taken this pay cut and technically been furloughed, but still been working because you can't close prisons. So, you know, that case alone could cost the state more than, I think, $40 million a month in back pay. I mean, we're really talking big numbers here. And I think there's valid questions about whether this entire policy has been a failure. I mean, in addition to the issues about back pay, there's all these employees that are now not taking vacation time. They're going to cash that out at some point. So, you know, I think there's valid questions about whether they're kind of kicking the can down the road, so to speak.
If the court upholds the idea that they have to stop the furloughs or reverse the furloughs, will the governor propose some alternative way to save that cash? Are they going to cut jobs or do other things to take some measure to reverse the
I mean, it's
impact?
hard to say on an immediate basis. I think, yes, obviously, this one suit, the governor's attorneys have said would cost the state $140 million to send these guys back to work for the rest of the year. I think what you'll probably see happen is a lot of threats of layoffs and things like that, but ultimately, they're just going to add this to the tab. I mean, let's not forget, the state has a $20 billion deficit right now that could grow or shrink depending on a lot of different factors, but, you know, they don't kind of have to pay the same way we do. So there's always more cash going out than coming in at any particular time. So I think what you're going to see is legislators, lawmakers in the governor's office have to make tougher decisions down the road.
Well, the one thing we know is that if you cut hours to the degree where they are now, or if you cut employees later on, services have really been impacted by this.
They have. I mean, we're talking everything from longer lines at the DMV to people not getting their employment checks or not qualifying for disability as soon as they could have. So what folks like the pro tem of the Senate have argued is this isn't just an issue about state workers. This is about the state economy. And I think that you've also seen studies sort of debunking a lot of the governor's numbers, saying, look, even if you're saving money on the front end, on the back end, you're losing, say, taxes we could have collected that now we can't because the statutes run out. So I think there are a lot of concerns about whether or not this is actually going to do more harm than good.
And then we have the fact that the governor will go home near the end of this next year.
That's right. I mean, somebody else's problem.
It will be. I mean, really, especially when you look at things like vacation pay that's going to get cashed out, that could happen years from now. So the sort of full cost of these and impact will probably fall to the next governor, whoever that may be.
Well, our next story has to do with a giant move that could cost a lot of money, but this time in the private sector. So, Eric, Google has moved its operation from mainland China. What has been the reaction from other Silicon Valley companies and the Chinese government?
Well, the other Silicon Valley companies have said very little as possible. No one, almost no one, has stepped up to pat Google on the back and say, we're with you in solidarity and leave China with them. To the contrary, Microsoft and a number of other companies who work in the technology business have basically said, we're staying in China, there's a big market, we will work within their rules and try and make change from within. So it's Google's kind of standing alone here. There's one small company, GoDaddy, which is a company that registers domain names, but it's probably more famous for their Super Bowl commercials, I think, that has said that they will stop registering Chinese internet domains, but it's very small business for them. But none of the major companies are saying they're going to leave.
What is Microsoft's response to this? Are they pretty excited?
Well,
take that business.
this is actually an opportunity for Microsoft. Yeah. Microsoft has a search engine called Bing that has actually been doing better domestically. They are less than 1% of the market in China, so they see some opportunity to gain some market share. But Microsoft's position is, we've been doing business in China for more than 20 years. We will continue to do business in China, and that's despite the fact that they are aware of the restrictions and dangers of working there. There's a very high rate of piracy for Windows, for example, in China. And so they are aware of the situation, but they believe that the market opportunity is so big that they really can't afford not to be there.
Background on why Google made such a surprise move, we'll say.
Well, so this really started in January. Google had been operating in China and had been censoring the search engine results as the government had requested. However, Google announced that they discovered that their website had been hacked by parties in China. They didn't say that it was the government, but they certainly hinted pretty strongly that it was. And in fact, what was happening was that someone had hacked into the Gmail, of course, is the email service from Google, into Gmail accounts held by dissidents who were opposed to the Chinese government, and basically reading all of their email. Google reacted by saying, this is unacceptable, we're going to change our policy on censoring search, and now we've gotten to the point where they're actually going to leave. At the time this happened, Google did say that they were not the only company that had been hacked, that there were maybe 15 or 20 others. The names have not really come out, and I think no one else has stepped up to say we're getting out of China.
What does this mean then for people inside of China? Particularly, I'm thinking of for academic researchers who rely on Google really to find journal articles, those sorts of things. I mean, what does the internet look like for them now that they don't essentially have Google? Well, certainly Google was not the only search engine in China. The largest player is a company called Baidu, which is a local Chinese search engine. There are a number of other players. Microsoft is there. Yahoo China is actually a company that's not owned directly by Yahoo, but does operate in China, and there are a few other local players. So you have other ways to find information. Interestingly, most of the coverage about the reaction within China has been that the majority of the citizenry seems to be supportive of the government. There is, however, a sizable minority that thinks that this is unfair and not a good thing.
So we're talking about one of the biggest markets, that exists,
yes,
potentially.
Absolutely.
Google's share of market, though, was not that great. So do they stand to lose a lot of money in the near future or on the long term?
Well, so they were the number 2 player. They had about a third of the search engine market. But of course, the market in China is still, while growing fast, is still relatively small relative to the rest of Google's business. It's by some estimates, 1 or 2% of their revenue. So leaving China is not going to devastate Google's bottom line. On the other hand, the opportunity in China on the internet, as in many other areas of commerce, is tremendous. So the question is whether if they walk away now, are they giving up huge upside if you look 5 or 10 years down the road? And it's a risk. That's why I think some people would prefer that Google had stayed, tried to find ways to work within the system, and to find maybe a quieter way to find some change.
This week, though, Senator Durbin of Illinois held hearings in which he thought he was going to get a lot of people from Silicon Valley there to talk about this. A few people showed up. He's threatening or saying that he would like it if you were violating human rights laws, that you could he could send people to jail almost.
Yes, well, this is the interesting thing is that it is a huge business opportunity for everyone, and there have been other situations where other companies have had run-ins in China. Several years ago, Yahoo got into a situation where they were providing information to the Chinese about a dissident who was eventually jailed, and they eventually left the market and basically sold their business to another company. So you're not going to find too many people who are going to want to jump in and take Google's side, I don't think.
Well, my thanks to all of you for joining us here tonight. And now some other news from this week. PG&E has proposed major changes to how it sets electricity rates. If implemented, the new system would cut prices to those who use the most energy and charge more to those who use less. It would provide relief in areas such as the Central Valley, where bills soar during the summer months, but rates would likely rise for Bay Area residents who use less energy. California could be the first state in the nation to legalize and regulate the recreational use of marijuana. The issue will be before voters in November. Opponents say that it would increase the use of the drug and put more demands on law enforcement. Supporters argue that legalization would make it more difficult for minors to buy marijuana, and police would be free to concentrate on more serious drug activities. Also, taxes from the sale of legal pot would raise revenue for the state. And California could also be the first state to ban cigarette smoking in all of its state parks and beaches. If signed into law, a $100 fine would be imposed on people who violated the ban. Finally, we've been following the story of the planned closure of the NUMMI plant in Fremont. It is on schedule to shut down on April 1st. Some workers will let go this week. Coming up later in the program, meet John Boland, KQED's new president and CEO. The Torah Project special scribe at the Contemporary Jewish Museum. And Food Wars on Food and Wine this week with Leslie Sabacco. The Department of Fish and Game meets in April to decide the fate of this year's salmon fishing season. It's expected that certain types of salmon will return in higher numbers, but the coho salmon population has sharply declined. From KQED's Quest series, here's a story about efforts to protect the coho in Northern California and the important role salmon plays in the native ecosystem.
In the northern reaches of California, a cool stream rambles through the shade of the redwood canopy. Within the cool water lives the past, present, and future of the native forest. Biologists and researchers are on a fishing expedition, searching for the one that's getting away.
Courtney and I found our first fish of the day. When we got closer, we noticed that there were in fact two fish, one larger female and a smaller jack.
Following the instincts of their ancestors, coho salmon are returning from the ocean to the very streams where they were born. Here, in a cycle of renewal, they will spawn and die, but give new life to not only the next generation of salmon, but to the forest itself. The temperate rainforests of the Pacific coast are home to some of the largest trees in the world. The scientific question is, how can these massive redwoods grow in soil that is considered nutrient poor and nitrogen deficient?
One of the reasons why redwoods grow as big as they grow, it's because they get first-class fish fertilizer. The salmon and sort of their habitats have evolved together. The salmon have very specific requirements from their habitat, and the habitat gets a great deal from the salmon because they go out into the ocean and they get all these nutrients and they bring them back.
Core samples from ancient redwoods have suggested the best tree growth years also coincide with years of good salmon runs.
With thousands of coho in the coastal streams, we're going to continue to have healthy redwood forests and healthy habitats to support bears, foxes, river otters, herons, you name it. So if you want to see the beautiful redwood coastal ecosystems survive, you're going to need to advocate for more coho survival as well.
There was a time when it was said the rivers and streams of Northern California were so thick with salmon that you could walk across their backs and not get your feet wet. Historically, the most abundant species in the state has been the Chinook, or king salmon. But in the last 10 years, the thriving Chinook fishery has crashed. This drop prompted the federal government to completely cancel the salmon fishing seasons in California for 2008 and 2009. Today, all the salmon species found in the state are at risk, but the coho, already low in numbers and off limits to all fishing, is in the most peril and may be facing extinction.
Coho salmon in California are listed as critically endangered. We need to do everything we possibly can to allow the diminished fish populations we have to survive. The importance of protecting these fish is really protecting the environment that we all depend on.
The causes of salmon decline are many. Dams, overfishing, logging, and water diversion are much to blame. But natural conditions like drought and temperature fluctuations in the ocean, which have reduced nutrients for salmon, also have played a role. Salmon are anadromous. That means they're born in fresh water, migrate to the ocean where they grow to adulthood, then return to the rivers to lay their eggs. As a result, they're vulnerable, both in the watershed and in the ocean.
In years when the nursery habitat is good in the freshwater and the ocean conditions are poor, which is a natural cycle, the fish can kind of get along. But when we have poor habitat conditions inland and poor ocean conditions like we have now, that buffer is gone. And so the population staggers and crashes like it is now.
The habitat of the Russian River has been so impacted that direct human intervention is needed now to keep the next generation of coho, and possibly the future of the species, alive.
Those fish were at a breaking point. We've made the decision back in 2001 to take some fish out of the wild, bring them into the hatchery with the idea of magnifying their numbers quickly to meet some of the habitat restoration projects. As it turns out, we were just in time because that fish population, that wild component of the fish population, no longer produces enough fish for us to rely on.
At the Warm Springs Hatchery near Healdsburg, state biologists are taking a hands-on conservation approach to breed Russian River coho in captivity.
When this program first started in 2001, we were able to collect wild fish for 3 consecutive years, which corresponds to the 3-year life cycle that coho salmon are on. Well, beginning in 2004, the number of wild fish that we encountered was slim to none. So if we literally started our program a year later, we wouldn't have even had 3 consecutive year classes to do this. If we didn't act when we did, not only would we have not had this program, I don't think there would have been any hope for the coho salmon in the Russian River watershed.
Think of this broodstock as a sort of genetic lifeboat for the species, with the goal that coho raised here will someday be able to live and breed on their own in the wild.
Is that unlike production-style facilities where there's sort of no end in sight in the making of these fish, we would love to back away at some point from all of this manipulation of this fish population and allow them to spawn, reproduce, return to the streams naturally on their own. But this is not the way salmon normally start their life.
Right.
Let's take a look at
so basically our spawning protocol here is different than typical hatcheries. We spawn all of our fish according to a breeding matrix. So that lets us know which males are the best appropriate spawning partners for each female. So that allows us to maximize our genetic variation and avoid any sort of inbreeding effects. So this is one female's eggs and thus offspring spawn with 4 different males, and we keep them separate through the swim-up phase so we can see the success of not only the female, but each male that she spawned with, and we can really track the success of each fish in our program to the next generation.
38.3.
When the fish are about a year old, they're implanted with a tiny tracking device before being released into the wild. But hatcheries alone can't save the salmon. Water diversions must be reduced, logging and development moved away from stream edges, and obsolete dams modified to allow salmon to pass. Only then will the natural setting be right for the coho to return and achieve true long-term sustainability.
We're certainly optimistic about the return of coho. Everything's right here. We've got great habitat, we've got improved practices. Now we need the right set of winter conditions and the right set of summertime conditions.
Everything is intertwined. The water, the trees, the salmon, and us. Connecting the dots and understanding the importance of maintaining the whole system may be the key to saving it all.
I believe that if everything comes together the way it needs to, that eventually we will have viable fisheries again. It's going to take a lot of work, and it's going to take a lot of sacrifice on a lot of people's parts. The question is whether or not they're willing to make that sacrifice. But I think that they are worth saving, not just because they taste good, but also because, you know, they're a very important part of an entire ecological system. And I think if we lose our healthy watersheds, I think if we lose our coastal streams, we will have lost something much more important than simply the salmon.
3.
Well, for more stories about the salmon and updates on this year's fishing season, visit KQED's Science and Environment series, Quest, at kqed.org/quest. KQED has a new president and CEO. John Boland was at KQED for more than a decade and has now returned after 4 years as Chief Content Officer for PBS. He joins me now to talk about KQED and its future. Welcome home, John.
Thank you. It's great to be back.
So what did you bring back to us from PBS?
Well, I learned a lot during my time working at the national level and really had the opportunity to actually see how special the Bay Area is and KQED is in all of public broadcasting across the country. There's very few places that are quite like this, but it's great to be back.
Well, you were at this place when you were the first to, I guess, come up with the title of Chief Content Officer. Now, that's an unusual title in television hierarchy. Explain a little bit about that concept and how it's still playing out.
It actually originated in Silicon Valley, so that was the first place I had heard of the title, and you're right, it wasn't used that much in television. And as we've gone through this digital revolution and the need for bringing together all the platforms, television, radio, online, content for classrooms, mobile phones, it seemed to make sense to have everyone reporting up to one executive who would be in charge of content rather than in charge of just TV or radio or online. Really just trying to break down the silos, as they say.
Does that become more complex, though, when you're in a community like ours of such diverse interests and goals for each community?
Well, it's complicated no matter where you are, simply because we're so used to specializing. People who specialize in television or specialize in radio or specialize in online. But what's interesting is that consumers are really leading the way, because as you know, we and especially our children and grandchildren use every kind of media. So nothing's going away, we're just adding. So we have television, we have radio, people both watch television and listen to the radio online, as well as interact with the producers of the content, with each other. It really becomes more of a community gathering place rather than just a place to consume content.
Mm-hmm. You're in the Bay Area, so when you talk about consolidating decision making, how hard a job was it for you to convince people that that was a good thing, that it wouldn't impact the content that we receive from KQED?
You know, people are resistant to change, so there's no question about that. But I think it really amounted to keeping our eye on our public service mission. And if the people of the Bay Area need us to serve them on multiple different media platforms, then we want to be there to do that. And the thing that I found both at PBS and at KQED is, and as you know, because you're one of the people here, we're all here for the same reason, really, to serve the public. We're a public service organization, and as the people we serve are changing, we need to change with them. And I think when we look at it that way, if we look externally instead of internally and think about the community, then it's a little easier to make the changes.
And are we in the midst of a change in terms of those people who we're serving as we've made this expansion into these these new areas of communication?
We are in the midst of an amazing change. One of the things I had the opportunity to do when I was working at PBS headquarters was talk with people at a lot of other media organizations and get the opportunity to see how things are happening in other communities, and also look at in academia, what are people who study history and study media thinking of this. And there are a number of experts who believe that this change we're going through with digital technology and what it's doing to communications actually is the biggest revolution since the invention of the printing press. And one of the reasons we're having as much turmoil as we're having right now is because that just throws everything, into a confusing state. Now, after the invention of the printing press, one of these professors reminded me there was 100 years of war and strife and complete confusion. And I'm not suggesting that we're going to have 100 years of it, but we've certainly been through several years. And as you can see, what it's doing to the newspaper business and news gathering in general is really extraordinary.
It impacts this program because we depend a great deal upon the coverage from the print media for the reporters who come on for our news segments, because they're the guys with the deep pockets of knowledge, and that landscape is changing. Is KQED building its own well of well-informed people who can fill in those gaps, that some of them being left by?
We're looking at doing that. We're looking really at doing two things. One would be, yes, actually expanding KQED's own capability to do enterprise reporting and to be out trying to fill some of the gaps that have been created by the fact that there are fewer newspaper reporters out there. But the second thing I think we really need to do, and it's something we're going to have to look at in a number of areas, is partner with other institutions. And as you know, we have partnerships with the Center for Investigative Reporting. We have partnerships with the San Francisco Chronicle and the San Jose Mercury News. And I think we're going to need to do even more of that. I think that a number of institutions, like-minded, who care about having an informed citizenry, which is of course critical in a democracy, need to work together to fill these gaps. I just don't think any one organization is going to be able to do it. And I think at KQED, being a nonprofit, we're pretty non-threatening in terms of the commercial media. We're not competing with them for every advertising dollar, but we can join with them to serve the public.
What do you see as KQED's greatest strength? And maybe those things in which you would like to see change?
To me, the greatest strength is actually where we are. This, the other thing that I learned working at the national level and having the opportunity to see public broadcasting as it exists in other markets, KQED is a very special place because this is a very special community, Northern California. It's probably the most receptive and supportive region of the country for public broadcasting. The millions of people who watch KQED television and listen to KQED radio are much larger in number than you find in a lot of other communities. So I think that's very special. We're blessed being here. And as far as the challenges, the challenge hasn't changed that much for public broadcasting. It's funding. And it's even more so now in this new digital environment because, as you know, you still have hundreds of thousands of viewers watching your show, but they're also going online, and they're even interacting with you and This Week in Northern California online. Well, that extra work and extra media platform requires additional funding for us to be able to use or even experiment with these new platforms. And I think a lot of people thought when the digital revolution began that television and radio were going away. Mm-hmm. And I think you can even remember, you probably had people on the show 10 years ago from Silicon Valley saying the end of television as we know it. Well, television as we know it is still going strong, and so are many other means of reaching the public. So we're spread pretty thin, and I think we need to find new sources of support too.
Which brings us to the expansion of KQED's imprint. We're part of Northern California Public Broadcasting. How much does that help you, or how much does that hurt you in terms of the financial burdens now that you maybe not a burden, but obligations to keep all of that moving.
Well, I think it helps. What's interesting in terms of the merger with KTEH in San Jose, I think that it made a tremendous sense and was really logical, because instead of having two public television stations serving some of the same communities and then some different communities competing, they're in total cooperation. And so I think from that point of view, I think we can serve the community better because we don't have any duplicative services now, and we can be more efficient and more effective. So I think it's actually a good thing.
Any big dream?
Well,
quickly.
my big dream would really be that this institution becomes the 21st century model for what public service media can be.
It sounds like a fantastic dream. Thank you so much, John. We welcome you home.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, Monday at sundown marks the beginning of Passover, the Jewish holiday that celebrates the Israelites' flight from Egypt and slavery. The story of Passover is recorded in the Torah, the sacred text and foundation of Judaism. In an unusual exhibit at the San Francisco Contemporary Jewish Museum, a scribe is writing out the entire Torah, letter by letter. As we see in this story from KQED's Spark production, what makes it even more extraordinary? The scribe is a woman.
אתה תדבר את כל אשר אצווך, ואהרון אחיך ידבר אל פרעה, ושילח את בני ישראל מארצו. You shall repeat all that I command you, and your brother Aaron shall speak to Pharaoh to let the Israelites depart from his land. I generally say or sing or chant a prayer or a line to get in a ready state and a focused state with the right intention.
Julie Seltzer is a soferet, or scribe, performing a tradition that has been passed down for thousands of years. A feather quill, bottle of ink, and 62 sheets of parchment are all she needs to create a sacred Torah.
A scroll of the Torah is probably the oldest continuous document that humanity has. And the Torah scroll, that is the handwritten scroll of the 5 books of Moses, represents God's wisdom and what human beings need to know in order to be human beings. For someone to take on the sacred, holy responsibility of writing a Torah is an extraordinary commitment.
I don't think of joy and hard work as being separated. It's also an opportunity to be more quiet in a world that often feels very rushed and loud and overwhelming.
The scribe is governed by elaborate rules for how the scribe would copy a Torah, including the number of letters in each book and the number of paragraphs and the number of columns. And they're all checked and double-checked to make sure that the Torah that we read in the synagogue today is, to the best of human capabilities, flawless and exactly like the one God, according to legend, gave Moses on Mount Sinai, that was written in black fire on white fire.
So this is one of my favorite letters, the letter Pei. While it's a Pei with the black ink, in the formation of the letter, what you see on the inside in the white space is actually another Hebrew letter. It's the Bet. I read the words and then I say them and then I write them. It helps the scribe to not make errors.
Though she is following centuries-old scribal rules, Julie is actually breaking with tradition in 2 ways. She is a woman in a field dominated by male scribes. And instead of a scribe's customary solitude, Julie is writing her Torah in public view at the Contemporary Jewish Museum.
According to traditional Jewish law, only a Torah that's written by an adult Jewish male will be kosher for use. So this is why women haven't historically been scribes.
Barred from traditional scribal schools because of her gender, Julie looked online and found a teacher willing to train a woman.
The Torah that Julie is writing for us will be the second Torah ever written by a woman. 20 years ago, it was not common to find very many female rabbis. And things have really changed and progressed. And so I'm hoping in 20 years it will not be unusual to have a female scribe.
For Julie, being commissioned to write a Torah was a dream come true, but performing a spiritual act in public is proving a bit of a challenge.
I don't know of any other museum who's really over a year period had somebody, in a sense, on view doing their work. There are artists who, as part of a performance piece, their work includes people and interaction, but not something that's trying to produce something that then will be sacred and used. So we really have been struggling with how to balance the interest of our visitors with the needs of Julie as she writes the Torah.
When she first started, visitors used to come right up to Julie to peer over her shoulder. Now her space is cordoned off, and a live video projection offers a voyeuristic view of her hand at work. Regularly scheduled breaks allow visitors the chance to ask their most burning questions.
I'm just wondering, I'm sure there are times when there are mistakes made, and I'm just curious about how you fix those mistakes.
Thank you for recognizing that certainly there would be mistakes. The biggest myth is that a scribe can't make any mistakes, and if you make a mistake, you have to start the whole Torah over, which I think is kind of a remarkable myth, simply because people actually believe it, which is amazing.
Because something is holy, it doesn't mean that you necessarily want to stay away from it, because holiness is also about coming close to something. So for me, that's what's amazing, to be able to share that process. I get to be very close to the Torah as I'm writing it, and people, as they watch, can also be part of that process.
Before she became a scribe, Julie was a baker for a Jewish retreat center. She would often shape ritual breads into her favorite scenes from the Torah.
I've made everything from a scene of people getting swallowed up by the earth. It was a giant mound challah ripped apart with little people flailing about, to ritual objects, and this year is based on scribal oddities or interesting things connected to a scribe's work. So it's usually words or other things connected to how Torah is written.
As part of her residency at the museum, Julie is combining her dual passions for baking and scribal arts by conducting food for thought workshops for visitors.
We're going to be making hamantashen, but that's not the only thing that we're going to be doing. We're going to be talking about the holiday of Purim.
After studying a passage from the Torah, the class gathers in the museum's kitchen to make baked goods related to that portion of the text.
I love doing baking workshops and sessions because it's a way for people to connect with Torah with an easier entryway than the text, and everyone gets to participate and everyone gets to learn through doing.
Taking time to interact with the public has its rewards, but at this point, Julie's beginning to feel the pressure of completing the Torah. She's about a third of the way through and must finish by December. At the rate of 1 column a day, the work is painstaking and precise.
Kind of like if you're going to run a marathon, you have the training schedule, and if you follow the schedule, you'll be ready to run the marathon. So I have my Torah schedule, and if I write the amount that I need to write every day, then I'll complete it on time, God willing.
Right around the corner from Julie's desk, visitors can lift a cloth to see a few of the sheets completed so far. Eventually, they will be bound together into one scroll and offered to a community in need of a Torah.
One of the great things about learning about the Torah is that they're always done anonymously. So there's only 304,805 letters. It does not allow you to sign your name to the Torah. We'll be sending this Torah out in the world to be used, and eventually no one will even know that Julie wrote this Torah, because it will just be one of the Torahs being used by a congregation somewhere who will really read it and use it as a sacred object, and who wrote it is not important, but it will have a new life as a living document.
Julie Seltzer continues her work at the Contemporary Jewish Museum until October 3rd. And what a fitting way to recognize the changing role of women during Women's History Month. Well, Leslie Sabranco is back with another edition of Food and Wine this week. Her latest find has a lot in common with March Madness, except that instead of playing out on the basketball court, this hard wine competition starts in the kitchen.
That's right. This new event is taking over the Bay Area's foodie underground, where both home and seasoned professional chefs compete for the title of San Francisco Food Wars champion. And joining us in the studio is SF Food Wars creator and founder, Jeannie Che, along with our own Bay Area Bites blogger, Stephanie Rosenbaum, whose cookie baking skills were put to the test in the Food Wars' latest competition. Now, Jeannie, how did you get the Food Wars concept off the ground? This is the 6th event you've had?
This was the 5th event.
5th event.
We're working on our 6th now.
All right.
So basically, San Francisco is such a wonderful city for food in general, but when it comes to the events, they tend to either be free and way too accessible, or really exclusive and not accessible. And this was our opportunity to do something for everyone with a really accessible price.
And what is the price to get into
$10 to $14, and our proceeds benefit the SF Food Bank, which is really awesome.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
So what were some of the earlier events? This one was obviously cookies, and we'll talk about it, but what were some of the earlier events that you did?
We have had mac and cheese battle, mini cupcakes, holiday sides, artisan bread, chocolate cookies, and then coming up will be a Muse brunch and a bite.
A Muse brunch.
We're expecting a lot of bacon.
No, there's nothing wrong with bacon. So tell me, Stephanie, because you were a competitor this time.
Right. This was my Top Chef moment. It was very fun. I'm an amateur baker, and so I heard about it, and I came up with, a fun name, and a fun name for my team, and a fun name for the cookies. They were my Mint Mojos. And I just wrote in, and I guess I got picked out of about, you could say you'd get about 80 competitors, or wannabe competitors, and you picked 20.
And you picked 20, and again, that can be a mix of professional or amateur chefs.
It's always a mix of pros and home chefs.
That's terrific.
And so then we had to make 200 cookies and show up at the event. And as soon as I got there was a line out the door. And we all set up our little cookie stations. And then everyone that bought a ticket got to come in and load up their plates with cookies. And
so they actually get to taste too, because you have judges, right?
Yes. So we have our judging panel, and they choose judges first, second, and third, and our eaters choose, they vote, they get one vote, but we have a People's Choice and a People's Choice Honorable Mention Award.
Right, so if you're paying $14 or $10 to come into this event, you're getting to eat a lot of cookies.
Totally.
Is basically what you're saying.
It's so worth it.
Yeah, and your opinion counts, which is really
your opinion
fun.
really counts.
It's not just the people who are the professional judges,
That's
quote
right.
unquote.
And there was a photographer award too. So the woman who gilded her cookies with edible glitter,
Photog's Choice. Photog's Choice.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's true.
So
And the atmosphere itself is all about energy and fun.
Totally. Celebrating food, being with other people who love food as well, and celebrating, enjoying it in San Francisco.
Yeah. All right, well, we visited the event last Sunday, and this is what we found. Now, there's people of all ages that come to these events, aren't they?
Oh yeah, we've had competitors as young as 12 and old as 70. Not lying.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, you know, and people are lined up out the door. You sell out these tickets. I think that's fascinating. You sell out these tickets in minutes.
Minutes, yeah. So basically, we do an event announcement, and through Twitter, Facebook, our own site, sffoodwars.com, and our local media, who
And
are
bloggers,
wonderful,
again,
and bloggers like Bay Area
Yeah,
Bites.
yeah. Right. Of course.
People just get the word out. They set their calendars and they reload at 11:59, and then they get the tickets.
You tweet it, and then they're sold.
gone. And
now, how was it being a competitor?
Oh, it was so much fun because people took it really seriously. All the eaters who came in, they, you know, you could tell they were tasting each cookie. They really had opinions. They wanted to talk to you about what was in your cookie.
Speaking of which, I see cookies right here. I'm going to reach over and grab.
So that's another wonderful thing about San Francisco is everybody has an opinion.
That's right.
About their food, and so you could definitely see that.
Which is why Check Please is so successful, because people love to be involved and love to have a voice about the food. And I think that's why the underground movement right now, when we talk about in San Francisco, is really gaining traction, because people can be involved.
People want, it's a lot more personal that way.
That's right.
Food gets more personal.
All righty, ready to eat your cookies?
Yes.
I have to say thank you both for joining me today. You can find Stephanie's post along with the recipe for her cookies, photographs of the SF Food Wars event at kqed.org/Bay Area Bites, or watch Check Please Bay Area at kqed.org/checkplease. Until next time, cheers! Cookies and milk.
Well, that's all for tonight. We hope that you'll visit our website, kqed.org/thisweek. That's where you can watch complete episodes and segments. Subscribe to our newsletter and our podcast, and share your thoughts about our stories. I'm Belva Davis. Good night.
Major funding for Quest on This Week in Northern California is provided by the National Science Foundation, the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation, the Richard and Rhoda Goldman Foundation, and the Amgen Foundation. Additional support is provided by the following: